In aperture priority, you can change just the size of the aperture. So a smaller number means the aperture is wider, works the opposite. And the larger number means the aperture or the opening is smaller. So you're letting in less light. So what the camera does in aperture priority is it adjusts one of the other two settings, mainly either the ISO or the shutter speed. If you leave it on auto ISO, then the camera will adjust the ISO to maintain the exposure that you have set. So here you can see the exposure compensation is set to -1. So if I leave it at 1.4, which is its widest for this lens, and you half press the shutter, you can get a preview of what the ISO will be for that exposure compensation. If I close the aperture, use a larger number, thereby making the opening smaller, and then get a preview, you should see that it needs a higher ISO to maintain that exposure. Close it even more. You can even see the image getting a little grainier. So a higher ISO is going to give you more noise. Again, wider aperture with auto ISO. Preview, you only need 800 for this setting. Now, of course, you can change the exposure compensation, which is telling the camera I don't need that much light. And then you can get even a lower ISO. Now, obviously, this is underexposed. You can brighten it in Lightroom or your editing software, but it's better to get it right in camera to begin with. If you take it off auto ISO, say use the lowest ISO setting, now the camera will have to adjust the shutter speed to maintain the exposure. So if you notice, if I close the aperture down, the exposure or the shutter speed is getting longer. It's going to stay open longer. So now if at f11 for this exposure compensation, the camera will require a 2-second exposure. It's going to be difficult handheld, possible on a tripod. Now we can increase the ISO. Let's say 1200. Let's see what that does. So now we need less time because the ISO and light are inversely proportional. So the higher the ISO, the less light you need because it makes the sensor more sensitive to light. All right, so in aperture priority, you can change the aperture, but then the camera changes one of the other two factors, either the shutter speed if you have a fixed ISO, or if you have auto ISO, the camera will then adjust the ISO to maintain the exposure.